Hello, friends and colleagues. Welcome back to the Think Catalyst weekly podcast, where my business partner, Vivek Kuchibotla, and I speak about everything that no one wants to speak about in advertising, but you've always wanted to know. So here we are again. Vivek, how are you this morning?
Good morning. Not happy to report that there's snow on the ground again and it's snowing outside. But aside from that, all good. I know everyone just loves my weekly weather reports from Chicago.
We want to know. We
Yeah.
want to know. We want to know.
Mhm.
Hey, so at popular demand, because this is a subject that comes up quite often. Today's podcast is going to be talking about briefs and the consequences, potentially some of the consequences that could potentially come out of poor development of briefs, and ultimately uh, the the hurting agency client relationships. So we'll talk a little bit about that today. It's interesting. The brief has consistently come up in many of our podcasts and conversations and in the comments of a lot of people. So here we are. We promised we would do a podcast focused on the briefs and some of the issues. And here we are. So Vivek, you wanna sort of put a little bit of framework around the content that we're going to be talking about today, and what inspired us to also bring this up.
Will do. But just before doing that, I want to say that whenever there's a discussion about briefs within the advertising world, it's always related to the quality of the work. And I think one of the distinctions we're trying to make in this podcast is, yes, the quality of the work will be affected, but ultimately the relationship will be affected.
Yeah.
And in a world where relationships, advertiser agency relationships are shrinking, I think this is a matter that is worth discussing, at least. The cause and effect, bad briefs, shrinking relationships. I think we have to touch on it a little bit, and that's kind of where we're going to be going in this podcast. And we're not affirming it, but it's worth discussing. So a little background on the Betterbriefs project. Two planners, Matt Davies and Peter Paul von Wheeler, got together a couple of years ago, and they did a survey among 1,731 agencies and advertisers around the world. And this was a survey to determine the state of briefs and briefings in the industry. And they came up with 5 very interesting findings. And while they've presented these findings around the world, they also came into contact with the IPA, the Institute of Practitioners of Advertising in Great Britain, which is one of the most prestigious advertising associations in the world. And the IPA saw these findings and decided that they would put their full weight behind what the Betterbriefs project came up with. And they recently jointly, along with Tom Fishburne, the marketunist, released a document with the findings that we're going to be talking about. So we encourage you guys to find that document. It's on LinkedIn, and read it through. But what we have here are basically the 5 key findings, and we're going to share them with you, and we're going to give you commentary, our perspective on each one of the findings. Should I go straight into it?
Yeah, no, I was just going to say and add to that, and that is, we all want to do great work. Anyone who works in advertising and who's passionate about this business, we want to develop great work. We want to be associated with campaigns that are recognized, but beyond recognition, that actually do something and move either a brand or a service, or get someone elected. Great campaigns are really a product of great briefs, and great briefs are really a series of strategic choices that you have to make in giving direction to your agency about what you want to do. So we're going to be talking about that, and fully support all of this with you, Vivek. So why don't you start off with the first finding?
Okay, and I'm going to read it so
Yeah.
I don't make a mess of it. So finding
Yeah.
number one, 78% of marketers believe their briefs provide clear direction. Only 5% of agencies do. To me, this is chilling. Why do you think this is happening?
Well, there's a lot of reasons around that. What a clear direction does is really paint a very clear picture about what success is supposed to be. And, without objectives, agencies really don't know where to go. But there's unfortunately a lot of issues around who is actually writing the brief, and who is actually approving the brief. So we're finding a number of things that have happened, and this is not just in the study. Most of us who have worked in the business, me recently up until 2 years ago, and you in the past as well, but even more prevailing over the last couple of years is, we have junior people writing the briefs, and trying to impress their bosses and putting everything but the kitchen sink in the brief. And ultimately, it should be the CMO who should be very involved at the sign off and making sure that the agency has a very clear direction and a very good brief to work with. Just some thoughts there, but I'm sure there's other ideas that you want to add to, Vivek.
I want to make a confession, because I started my career in brand management, spent 10 years in brand management. I wrote a lot of briefs, and what you said about brief writing is absolutely true. First of all, in the world of marketers, the brief is not the most important thing. They have other things to do that they consider to be more important. So it gets delegated down to the lowest person on the org chart, which is usually the assistant brand manager, who's had maybe 6 months experience right out of college, and has really no idea how to write a brief. So what he does, what I used to do, is find an old brief, and then use it as a template, but change keywords, put in my own marketing buzzwords to make me look really smart and really, really stand out when my boss would read the brief, because God forbid my boss would know that I just copied and pasted an old brief. I got to modify it a little bit, make it my own. But I was not doing it for the agency. I was doing it for my boss. And the sad part about this is that my boss, again, he has other things to do. He would kind of say, okay, fine, we're good. Send it to the agency. And then when we'd send it to the agency would receive it as, this is the client brief with a capital C.
Right.
This is the product of deep thinking and business analysis, and therefore we should take it seriously. And that wasn't the case.
Right.
That wasn't the case. So when the process starts out with a brief that's not properly written by people who are not yet prepared to write it, you end up with a situation where the client's real happy with his brief, the agency doesn't understand it. And that's what's reflected in this finding.
For sure.
And it's a scary thing.
There's so many other reasons as well, too. I mean, time pressures. How many times have we been faced with, the brief has to be written and sent to the agency in less than a week, and it's just going to be poor. So there's lots of issues around there. Lots of issues.
And I want to bring up one thing here that's tangentially associated with this, but every project has a timeline.
Yeah.
And all of the delays that are associated with the client are taken out of the time given to the agency. So if there's a delay of 1 week on the client side, that means one less week for the agency because the final due date never changes.
Yeah.
So that just makes the process worse. But that's a separate comment.
To me,
Yeah.
the most effective and powerful briefs was where there was a document that went back and forth with the agency. There was discussion and actually, again, reducing it down to the simplest thought about what we want to get through and out of the work. And then rather than just emailing it and here you go, I loved it when clients showed up at the agency and said, let's have a conversation. Let's have a cup of coffee. Let's discuss this. Bring in the planner, bring in the creatives. I really want to know, are we putting together the best brief for you? That is just an amazing conversation, worthwhile, completely. That, one hour and a half dedicated to that conversation is hugely important. And it's inspirational to the creative team. And it's not just a
Without a
creative
doubt.
team because a big idea can come from anywhere,
Without a doubt.
It's inspirational to everyone. So
Agreed.
food for thought.
And it to build on your point, the brief is not a document. The brief is actually the agreements that come out of a discussion.
Yeah.
So it's actually not, let's get together and fill out a form. No,
Yeah.
let's get together and have a discussion. And when we have an agreement, let's write it down on a piece of paper, which is a different way of looking at it. But it's, I've had those situations and they're by far the most productive ones. It works like that.
Let me go on to point number 2 because there's a similar discussion and conversation in point number 2 there that was found in the study, and that is, and I'll read it too. 61% of marketers and 71% of agencies believe that clear objectives are the most important element of the brief. When we talk about objectives, is what is the advertising supposed to do? What is it that we're trying to achieve with this product or service, etc.? The brief will have many things, but if we have that clear, the North Star is set as to where we want to take eventually the communications. It's more of the what. It's not about the how, because that will come later, but is what exactly is it that we're trying to do? So hugely, hugely important. And then, of course, how many times do we fail about getting that right, Vivek?
Well, also, I think that we have to understand that the objectives are advertising objectives, right? There's only so much that advertising can do. So we need to agree on specifically the role of the advertising. So when you hear, yeah, the advertising has to sell my product, well, the pricing has something to do with it, and the quality of the product and the distribution and all of that stuff, right? So yeah, let's agree on what the advertising objectives are. And I think it's easier said than done. And this is where the confusion happens, because everyone agrees that defining objectives are important on both sides, but they never quite nail it. And I think that's a function of having a lot of people involved, with every one of them with a point of view, and hierarchies on both sides. And so instead of actually making choices and excluding things, what you end up doing is, well, let's do this and a little bit of this, and let's have a secondary and a third objective. And that's where things go sideways. That's where it just doesn't work out. And I also think
when evaluating the idea, Vivek, I mean, this is not just about, we'll talk about evaluation later, but it's about setting the direction, but it's also setting what the expectation from the agency should be. You know, and again, the more diluted that is, the more confusing it is, or the more discussion later will happen, because the agency hasn't had that very clear direction. So it's going to become, and this is where waste and frustration sets in, and a whole bunch of other things that we'll talk about later, which is, you know, ultimately, you know, can have a big effect on the relationship as well.
Agreed.
Yeah.
And one final comment here. Again, the agency needs to push back on this, but it's delicate because when you start pushing back on things like objectives, you run the risk of actually showing up your client, and that's never a good thing. So you have to do it very carefully. You have to be firm, but you have to be careful when you do it, and that's where we run into trouble. Yeah.
Don't we, Vivek? Don't we know anything about that?
Me run into trouble?
Of
Me?
course
No,
not.
never, never, never. Um,
Look, you said a
okay,
hugely important point. We'll talk about it at the end, because ultimately, you know, if we accept as agencies the brief that we're given, then we're also responsible for the work that will come out there. So,
absolutely.
yeah.
So let me go to finding number 3.
Yeah.
And I'm going to read it again.
Yeah.
65% of agencies and 32% of marketers aren't clear on who the target audience is in briefs. And again, this is another finding which I find to be sobering, if not chilling, to be honest. So what they're saying here is that 65% of agencies are not clear on who they're developing advertising for. What do you think is causing that?
Well, if you can't picture who your target audience is and you're going after, just imagine what the creatives will think when you give them the brief. It is sobering. It is sobering, and it is chilling. I would agree. Time needs to be spent on making sure that a target audience is clearly defined, and good briefs have a very clearly defined target audience. Again, some of the issues, you know, everyone, we don't want to exclude anyone, you know, from being able to be, you know, to be impacted by the advertising. You know, there are, you know, 3 different points of view from the agencies. Often you'll see primary, secondary, third target. Just give me one. Yeah. If it's pregnant moms, it's pregnant moms. If it's adolescent children, it's adolescent children. If it's seniors over 65, let's just focus on one specific, and for that one project. And then, you know, maybe you'll do another brief for with a variation of the idea for a different target. But one brief should have just one target, not many.
Let me throw some gasoline on the fire here as well, as I'm
Troublemaker. You're
a
a
troublemaker.
troublemaker.
I like making trouble, but I think this is something that has to be said. And I'm going to use 3 examples to illustrate what I call the client agency bubble. Most people who work in marketing departments and most people who work in ad agencies are not reflective of the general population and struggle to understand how regular people live and think. So let's take the example. I'm going to use a US example, and I'm going to use a Latin American example, and probably a Asian example. And I've worked in all 3 markets, and I know that this is true. So if you're a marketer who's based in New York, your office is in Manhattan, you're working with a very cool agency that's based in Brooklyn, right? And you have to advertise to a housewife who lives in Arkansas. the truth of the matter is that you're working, you run the risk. I'm not going to accuse everyone. You run the risk of working off common denominator stereotypes that don't truly reflect who that target is or how she lives or what she thinks. What you're putting down in paper is what you think her life is like. Big difference. So that's the American example. Let me give you the Latin American example. The Latin American example, and this will hold in any country, in Mexico, Venezuela, Argentina, Brazil. Typical person who works in a marketing department is highly educated, often bilingual, many times private school educated, and who may have gone to university in the US or in Europe. Someone who works in an agency is similar in many aspects. These are not the typical people they're advertising to. Many people who will work in a marketing department in Mexico have never actually gotten on the metro system in Mexico City. Their contact with regular folks is very, very limited. They do not watch the soap operas that regular people do. They watch Game of Thrones on HBO. That's their frame of reference. And again, you have the same problem. People who are writing these briefs are talking to people who live different lives. Right. Very tricky.
Right.
Same thing will happen, and I worked in China, so I can say this as well. There's a big difference between coastal metropolitan China, where the ad agencies and the marketers are in the skyscrapers in Shanghai, and then rural China, where there's 600 million people.
Right.
Same disconnect applies, right? So beware of the client agency bubble, and check your thinking. Normal people are not stereotypes. Be very careful with that.
Right.
And I'm done with my rant. I won't say any more than that. But it is important.
But it is important.
Is important.
Of course it is. Of course it is.
It is important.
Of course it is. Get your target right, folks. Get your target right. Focus on that. It's so important because it'll really define the whole context of how you talk to your consumer. So
and be empathetic. Don't be judgmental about your target.
Point 4, Vivek. Couple more.
Okay. All right. You do this one.
Sure. Point 4, and I'll read it. 60% of marketers use the creative process to clarify their strategy. Wow. I've seen that so many times. And it's awful. It really is, because it completely takes the brief onto what other objectives should be and not necessarily what the focus should be. So comment on that, Vivek.
What this is really saying is, and I'm going to use the inner monologue, because a client would never admit this, but an advertiser would be thinking, I'm not clear exactly what I should put in this brief. So, hey, agency, I'm going to give you a deliberately vague brief so you can do many rounds of work, show me a lot of different approaches, and then when I actually see the right one, everything will click.
Yeah.
And you know, that is a way of working which I don't. There is some logic to doing it this way. The problem with this is that you're asking the agency to churn and burn and churn and burn until you finally find the right solution. And the way agencies are compensated nowadays and the way they're evaluated nowadays does not allow them to do the endless different alternatives. I'm going to present 10 different approaches or 15 different approaches over many months until we finally hit it and get it right. So I don't discard it as a way of finding a great idea, but I think given the current model of advertiser agency relationships, it's terrible to do this. You're basically bankrupting the agency when you
But
do this.
look, there's nothing wrong with the agency helping the client to find the strategic direction. But the brief is not the moment to do it. The moment to do it is earlier on in the process, in the planning process, and with account management normally present. Creatives can participate as well, but not in a creative process that's driven by a brief. So the hypothesis of where the strategic direction should be ironed out way before then, and then that is set in stone in the brief, and that will be the guiding light for the brief. But and agencies, we were talking earlier about being polite and pushing back, but it has to be a conversation that needs to be taken. And sometimes it may take a very senior person at the agency level calling the CMO or a CEO and saying, look, we're not really clear about this, and we should have a further discussion. And we don't want to hurt the relationship because we're bringing this up and we're pushing back. So quite important. Again, the agency can help solve the problem, but not at the briefing process. It's got to be much earlier in the planning process.
Agreed. And again, creative exploration can be a good thing. No problem with it, as long as it's packaged as a separate project where you're exploring. And the agency is compensated for the exploration. I'll give you one example of that. And you probably, since you worked on P&G at a competitive agency to mine way back when, but you worked in the same category, you worked on hair care at some point in time. I remember doing in the early 90s what we used to call exploratory work on hair shots. And a lot of the shots that were later developed and used for Pert Plus and then for Pantene. One of them was known as the peacock shot, where you actually, the model would have her hair go up and fall down and you shoot it from behind. That was the result of a creative exploration.
Yeah.
And it was really successful. And we were paid to do it. We weren't churning and burning. We were exploring.
Yeah.
So that's fine. But you can't ask an agency to churn and burn on a real project because you don't know what you want to do.
If exploring is a project, so be it. Those are fun to do. It's an exploration.
Very interesting.
It's not a definitive, a creative idea that will come out of there. So
yeah. I just want to go on record as saying that we on Pert Plus developed the hair shot that you guys stole for Pantene.
Oh yeah,
and made very successful on Pantene. And I just want to put that on the record.
If I'm not mistaken, it was done in Asia with
in Asia
with an Asian model and Asian hair, which tends to be much straighter and
heavier
bodied, and the drop shot, the hair, the healthy hair drop shot, as we
I remember all of that. It was fun.
Yeah,
I enjoyed it.
But that was this was a unique situation where there was an agreement that actually the marketer had, and in this case P&G, they had very clear ideas that no matter where an idea came from, if it was right for a brand because it fit the strategy, then they would use it. P&G will always say, if you have a new idea, if it fits the strategy, we'll bring it in. If it doesn't fit the strategy, we won't bring it in, period. So the strategy is very much the the guiding light.
Agreed.
I find that this fifth point and final point that we'll make, and then we'll go into conclusions. I mean, absolutely astonishing. 68% of marketers and 88% of agencies are not clear on how the work will be evaluated. Wow. That's heavy duty. That means
It
that
is.
a lot of work will probably go into the trash can because a lot of good ideas may go into the trash can. Or in the case of agencies, they go back in the drawer and they'll come out again later on in another brief. A secret of the business. But astonishing that they actually believe that. So, some of
Yeah.
your thoughts on that?
Well, I think the driving force behind this issue is the fact that everyone defines good differently.
Mhm.
So if you ask a marketer, they'll say one thing. If you ask creative, they'll say another thing. And I think in earlier podcasts, we've talked about the importance of a shared creative vision. And I think once you have a shared creative vision, you have the goalposts, you know exactly what you're aiming for, and it makes it very much easier for both sides to evaluate the work. If it's not clear how the work's going to be evaluated, this is a recipe for an endless loop of rework until finally the agency will just give up and say, you know what, client, let's make the pain go away. You tell me what you want. I'll put it into the script and let's just end this project. And that's the worst possible thing you can get from an agency and as an advertiser. So
We can't let personal opinions take over, Vivek, and that's why a brief is written. A brief is written so that the agency has clear direction, but it's also an incredibly impactful tool in the evaluation process. You know, when an agency does present their ideas and the client says, well, it's not red, it's blue. The brief said it was red. You know, let's go back to the brief and use that to evaluate the idea and go from there. So, an even more compelling reason for having a solid brief from the beginning, but also used when evaluating work. Great ideas will come from great briefs. I will guarantee you that we have seen that over and over and over, and it makes the evaluation process a lot more objective and not subjective when the brief is right. So hugely important.
A great idea is also the better the idea, the easier it is, in my opinion, to get people to coalesce around it. Mediocre ideas, there's a lot of discussion, but the great ones, you just sit back and say, that's it. I love it.
Yeah.
But everything else in the process needs to be working for you to end up in one of those winning ideas.
So
doesn't happen often.
You know, imagine just sort of as a big picture conclusion, you know, imagine how a good brief impacts an agency client relationship. Imagine what a bad brief does potentially to a client agency relationship. It's all about what happens in the middle in terms of the process, the work, the quality, the trust that there is between the agency and the client. You know, when there is the opportunity to really speak up, you know, the opportunity to speak up, to discuss, to say, you know, maybe we should review this and so forth. Those are all hugely important factors in and ultimately in the client agency relationships. And again, you know, as simple as it is, the brief, which is probably the single most important document that that an agency and a client will exchange and work on to develop work, has that impact.
Let's play it out for a second, because these findings are telling us that the briefing process has major issues. So we're working with a briefing process that is not functioning properly. We're going to get a mediocre creative product we're going to get lots of rework. We're going to get lots of time pressure because the rework leads into time pressure. We're going to end up with a lot of relationship stress. And although it's never talked about, we're going to end up with a very unprofitable account for the agency. And all of these things will result in the fracturing of the client agency relationship. So I think that's the starting point of this podcast. The question that we asked is a faulty briefing process affecting the advertising agency relationship? And I think the case is pretty solid to say that yes, it is affecting it. So if your relationship's not great, you want to look at the process and see if it's working properly and if you can fix it. And that brings us to the question of how do you fix it?
Right.
How do we fix it?
Right.
What do you think?
Right. Well, there's many ideas around that, but I think that, one of the things that we've always said is have a conversation about, how do you want to bring this forward in your particular agency, client agency relationship. Ask your agency how they wish to be briefed, how they would like the feedback on terms of the work. That is a terrific courtesy and a terrific initiative on the advertiser side, marketing side, to make the agency as comfortable as possible in the way they receive direction and they received evaluations. So
they will be so thankful. First of all, they'll be stunned because they're not expecting this, but then they'll be so thankful that you want to give them information in the way that they want the information to be presented. That's going to be really, really useful. And one final thing, once you come to an agreement with the agency and you decide to brief them the way they have asked to be briefed, then a lot of the excuses go away. Now the work should be better.
right.
And that's important as well. That's important.
We conclude this week's podcast. Vivek, thank you very much. So interesting, this topic, because it's come up, consistently in a number of other podcasts as well as conversations that we've had. But we hope it was useful. We hope it was helpful. Write to us, subscribe, like us, share us. Let's have a conversation. Let's build the conversations. We are, I think, Catalyst, we believe that, better relationships equal better work, and better results. And this is a huge element of that whole concept and purpose that we've come up with. We'll do a couple more podcasts before the end of the year. We're coming at the end of the year, but thank you for following us. We are gathering steam with these conversations, and hopefully, again, it was useful. Vivek, any parting words?
No, I think you summed it up very well. Looking forward to our next podcast. Sure we'll find something equally as interesting and controversial to talk about.
In between, you'll probably be shoveling snow a couple times, right?
Oh yeah, I will end up looking like Schwarzenegger by January.
Ooh, don't cross Vivek on any issues. He'll beat you up mentally here. Anyways, good to be with you, pal, and good to be with our audience again today. Have a great week, everyone, and we'll see you next week again. Thanks again for following us. Bye.
Talk to you soon. Bye.